I'm Harish. I'm the founder of Goodspeed. We're a low-code agency. And this is Jake, the founder of Swapstack, who are sold to Beehiiv. For me, Swapstack's one of the no-code success stories. I've been a fan from afar and loved how actually it's of the future or the now of building a startup because Jake and his co-founder Jake had met on an online entrepreneur program, right? They didn't know each other personally, and we'll talk about that. Then they hacked together their MVP with no-code tools. They iterated. Then they started building on Bubble, like a more comprehensive no-code tool. They got feedback. They iterated. They raised from angel investors. They grew. They got lots of traction. They grew. They iterated. They grew. They iterated and eventually got acquired by a bigger platform, Beehiiv. And so I'm super excited to hear about the story, lots of learnings and insights from Jake. So firstly, Jake, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, no problem. Excited to be here.
Let's start from the start because it's hard to find a co-founder. Just talk about how you found your co-founder in Jake and what that process was like. Particularly what were your expectations going through an entrepreneur program like On Deck?
So full context on like where I was a couple years ago. I actually went back to grad school. I had worked at Facebook for a while, so I kind of cut my teeth in the advertising space at Facebook. Oddly enough, left Facebook because I didn't want to be in the ad tech space anymore. Went back to school, and then I was in a 2-year grad program. And the second semester of the second year was when the pandemic hit. And at that time, I was doing some venture scouting for some early stage funds. And when the pandemic hit, it kind of threw off that whole scouting process. It was very in person. And I ended up I basically was going out, finding companies that were on campus, introducing them to funds. And I turned that process into a newsletter. That was right when like Substack was getting really hot. And so I basically started my newsletter. It still runs. It's called the Pre-Money List. I used Substack. I was sending out 2 companies that I was finding every week and basically just introducing them to any investor that wanted to read a newsletter or wanted to like look for or find new companies. So that was kind of when I got interested in newsletters and just saw the power of newsletters. At the same time, pandemic had hit. I had just graduated a grad program, didn't know what I was going to do next, but I was kind of ready to start a company. And On Deck, if anybody doesn't know what On Deck is like a entrepreneurial community for would-be founders. So people that all want to start companies that maybe have an idea or maybe are at the very early stages and looking for co-founders. On Deck kind of pulls people together. There's a lot of like co-founder dating, a lot of programming around like how do you find a co-founder? How do you start an idea? How do you go from 0 to 1? All that stuff. So I joined their then online program and was working on the newsletter for a while and joined a hackathon in On Deck. And basically, as part of my journey from the 0 to 1 for my newsletter for pre-money, I started realizing that people were like, other newsletter writers were sharing links with each other and basically referencing each other's newsletters to help grow. I joined a hackathon to try to build the first version of what Swapstack was, which was essentially swapping your Substacks. That's where the name came from. And Jake Singer, my would-be co-founder, had just quit his job. He worked at Amazon as a PM for a while, quit his job, started a newsletter, didn't know what else to do, joined On Deck, and he became one of the first swappers for the initial Swapstack product, which was a link swapping platform. That's how I initially met Jake. And then he just sent me a ton of really good feedback, and he kind of just like kept messaging me on Slack saying like, hey, I have this idea for this thing. Maybe we should think about advertising. I was thinking about advertising as well. So we kind of like leaned into that conversation. And then honestly, it was pretty organic from there. We kept talking. We both had a lot of time on our hands because we were stuck at home. It was during the pandemic. We were both working on newsletters and we both had an interest in starting a company. And so we kind of worked together in a very casual capacity for maybe 2, 3 months. And then we realized we both had this moment where we realized, like, hey, we're just spending so much time on this thing. Should we actually do it or not? And so almost right away after that moment, we realized this is something we should pursue. But we did want to make sure we were like well equipped as a pair to work together. So there's a co-founder survey run by or written by First Round Capital.
Yeah, the dating questionnaire I've seen.
The
Yeah.
dating question. Exactly. So we gave each other homework and we both spent a couple hours actually filling out that survey. And then we spent about 6 hours on a Zoom call just like going through each other's answers. And what surprised me about that survey is most of it is actually about like desired lifestyle, your personal values, your goals over the next couple of years, and not really about like what kind of company do you want to build? Like, what is your desired go-to-market strategy? What are your like core competencies, all that stuff. It was much more about just like personal alignment. And I think that's what really helped us realize, hey, we could be really good co-founders because we have very similar goals, very similar desires, and very similar work ethic. That was like the moment where I realized, hey, I think we could actually work together. Definitely got very lucky in that we both had a unique set of like timing circumstances in that he had quit his job, started a newsletter. I had just finished up school, started a newsletter, and it was the pandemic. So we were both stuck at home on the computer. But I think that's just how it happens. Like timing is a huge thing, personality is a huge thing, and then overall value alignment needs to be there too. I'll
Yeah,
stop there.
yeah, I've done an incubator and an accelerator and gone through it and not found a co-founder. And I've done the dating questionnaire. And I think that, like you said, risk or where you are, you said you were lucky that you were both at the same stage. And I think that's what entrepreneur programs like On Deck are really great at because they filter for people who are willing to take that risk. Actually, the majority of people, if they're on an entrepreneur program, maybe have quit their job to give this a full-time go, depending on the program. But beyond that, what insights or learnings do you have now looking back at that co-founder matching that you can share for people trying to find a co-founder?
Yeah, I would say I definitely think I was lucky that I met Jake. I would say if I didn't meet him, probably would have tried to build the company anyway. And looking back, I think it's really great to like have startups are hard and it's like the highs are really high, the lows are extremely low, and having somebody that you can commiserate with is super important. But when I talk to people now that are starting companies and they're not doing something because they're waiting to find a co-founder, my feedback is always like, just go do it. And like
Mm,
you'll attract the people that might be a good co-founder in the end. So I don't know if this is like directly answering your question, but I think like best advice I got and like now that I like give to other people is like if you have an idea, you can figure it out. You can find the right people to build it. You don't need a technical co-founder if you're building something technical. You can go and hire somebody to build an MVP and then you'll find your co-founder later on. I think another component is risk and equity. We don't have to like get deep into this, but like I think there's a misconception that if co-founders don't start at the exact same time working on a product, then they shouldn't get equal equity in a project or in a company. When in reality, like the story arc of a startup is typically like ours was really quick, but typically it's like 10 years and you have
yeah.
to be dedicated to a company for a really long time to see like a liquidation event. And so if the reason I'm saying that is like if you start working on a product and then 6 months later, after you've like made some progress, there's only so much progress you can make in 6 months. Then you meet your co-founder and he comes on board or she comes on board. That person is still taking on the same amount of risk for the most part as you are, and they should be compensated appropriately. I think a lot of times people get caught up and they don't want to bring somebody on as an equal partner or like give them significant equity. And that does deter a lot of people from being able to find co-founders
Yeah.
because they're very precious over their equity. When in reality, I think there needs to be a little bit more recognition that even if somebody comes on 6 months later, they're taking on the same amount of risk as you are. And if in 10 years they get paid out like a tenth of what you do for this, doing the same amount of work and taking on the same heartache and probably like affecting their lives in not a lot of negative ways in the same way you are, that's just not going to work out.
Yeah, it's a nice long-term perspective because even then, when you're making those hard decisions, I guess you want to feel as equal as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And you want that person to feel equal as possible so
Yeah.
they have skin in the game and they care as much as you do.
Yeah. And I guess in when you speak about actually if you can't find a co-founder, just do it and you'll attract people. In many ways, that's kind of what you did, right? You were working on the idea and then your co-founder Jake had been giving you passionate feedback. And so you initially aligned on interest and then amazingly aligned on desires and values after you went through that process.
Yeah, exactly. And he was kind of working on similar ideas on his side. So like we were both kind of like doing our own thing in our swim lanes and then realized like, hey, try and do very similar things and we have very similar goals. Let's just do it together.
Yeah. And so you decide to work together and then you decide to hack together this MVP. How did you decide to go from what was like swapping newsletters to then nail down the particular problem and then solution?
Yeah, couple questions in there. I'll kind of go backwards. So like the first, like figuring out like which problem to focus on.
Yeah, let's
When
start with that. Yeah.
so basically we knew from the get-go that like our customer set was going to be newsletter creators just because like we were both writing our own newsletters. We wanted to solve a problem for ourselves. And so we just started talking to a ton of people. We probably talked to a couple hundred different newsletter writers on all different scales. So like the Morning Brews of the world, and then like the upstart that has 50 subscribers, but is really amped up about what they're doing. Pretty much everybody had the same comments. They were like, we need help growing. So getting new subscribers, and then we need help monetizing. We want to make money off this thing. So the first concept of swapping links was helping folks grow. And there are ways to monetize that. And we did figure that out later on. But it was hard at the beginning to understand like where is the business here. And then the second problem that people talked about was monetization. And the way we tested that was we literally just went out and found a brand. There was a company called Main Street. They're still around. They're basically like a company that helps, I think mainly in the US, but helps companies get tax breaks.
Mm.
But we found them. They're like, yeah, we'll pay like I think it was $50 for any lead that you drive us. And so we took that and basically went out to newsletters and we're like, hey, do you want a sponsor in your newsletter? And we found a couple of newsletters that wanted to try that out. Basically, we tested out the concept of fulfilling the need of helping folks to monetize. And once we did that by connecting a brand to a publisher and literally seeing somebody come back to us and say, hey, you guys just helped me make the first dollar on the internet, that level of excitement, to be honest, was just really empowering to us and it was really fun. So we wanted to keep doing that. But then we also realized, hey, there's like by nature of how we're solving this problem, there is money being transacted, there's value being created. We're not yet realizing that value. We weren't taking a cut at the very beginning, but we can see where the money's flowing. So we know there's a business opportunity there. And so that's the one that we leaned into because it was like the most direct path to a business.
When you had that initial problem that you defined and then the solution, how did you start to measure whether it was working or not? Like, what were you specifically testing? How scientific were you about that approach?
At the very beginning, it's hard to say we were scientific. Even if you
Yeah.
have like a scientific approach, just the numbers are so small, nothing's significant. But it was relatively scientific. Basically, what we were doing was trying to get a sense of, hmm, I'll start somewhere else. So fundamentally, it was a marketplace. So we
Yeah.
had like a supply side, which was the number of publishers that wanted to monetize. And the product that we were selling there was like inventory in their newsletters. And then we had a demand side, which was advertisers. Um, we learned very early on that it was very easy to acquire the supply side because basically what we were doing was going out to publishers and saying, hey, we could help you monetize your newsletter if you log in and create an account, or if you like join the Slack community. And it was a very low barrier to entry, and there was no reason not to. So we were able to acquire the supply side pretty easily. And then we knew that once we had a certain level of supply in the form of, hey, we have 500 newsletters that speak to a finance audience, that allowed us to go out and find advertisers who were interested because we could tell them, hey, we have 500 newsletters and they reach 10 million readers, whatever it is. So the way we measured at the very beginning was really just like, how many newsletters can we acquire on the supply side, which represented one side of the opportunity for the marketplace. And then how easily are we able to take that interest in the supply side and translate it to identifying and bringing on demand? This is where it's not scientific. Basically, like if it just felt too hard, we probably wouldn't have done it because it would
Mm.
have been it would have been an indicator that the market's telling us this is just not what the market needs or wants. But what we found was that the market was looking for that. We basically, the pitch that we used and the conversation we had with a lot of advertisers was either, hey, there's a lot of advertisers that are trying to diversify advertising away from like Facebook, Instagram, et cetera, but they don't know where to do it and they don't know where they can do it at scale. So our pitch there was like newsletters are a super like intimate form of content and it enables you as a brand to put your put your brand in front of an audience in a really trusted voice because they read Harish's newsletter, they know Harish, they trust him. So if your brand is being recommended by him,
Yeah, nice.
are going to trust that recommendation. That was our pitch to brands that were like trying to diversify away from social. And then there was other brands that were like advertising and spending tens of thousands of dollars on like Morning Brew and 1440 and Packing McCormick's Not Boring. And so we would just go to them and say, hey, we saw that you sponsored Morning Brew. Do you want to sponsor like a bunch of other small newsletters that could probably drive better value? That was a much easier sell because they were already sold into the concept of newsletter advertising. So this was a very long-winded way of basically saying at the very beginning, we were measuring kind of by, I'll use the Gen Z term, like by vibes. Like, was the market telling us,
Yeah.
like, yeah, we're solving a problem on both sides of the supply and demand? And were we easily able to create that value transaction of an advertiser giving us money to get in front of the right people?
I want to talk about how then you went to actually hack the product together. But before we do that, you spoke about the sales side and actually just reaching out to people who are doing it already. How did you think about like that sales strategy to actually reach out to some of the big companies? And what were some of the specific tactics that you used to actually get in contact with them?
Hmm. Honestly, probably a lot of the stuff we use now still. I think if I remember correctly, we used tools like Hunter or just like LinkedIn and just found the email address or found a person on LinkedIn that seemed appropriate
But
and
the
just sent
filter
them.
was that your filter from a sales strategy perspective was they're already doing it anyway for a newsletter. Why wouldn't they work with us?
Exactly, yeah. And we probably at that time we were probably much more specific about what companies we were reaching out
Mm.
to. And we did kind of that marketplace dynamic I mentioned where we would look at our supply and just see like what kinds of newsletters are we attracting. And to use the same example, if we saw we have 100 newsletters that speak to the finance community, we weren't going to go out and try to find like a direct to consumer brand. We were going to go out and try to find like a finance company, or in that at that time, like a lot of crypto companies were growing and marketing quite a bit. So we go out to them. So we would take cues from both sides, and so we would go into Morning Brew and see like, okay, Robinhood or Betterment are advertising here. We have that supply to offer them. Let's go after them.
Okay, awesome. And 5 years ago, maybe what would have happened is you would have tried to reach out or find a technical co-founder and then build this marketplace on code. But you guys decided to hack it together with Slack, Zapier, Airtable. Just talk us through that process of version one. Like how manual was it really? And how
Yeah.
everyone talks about as well, like a non-beautiful MVP. And if it's beautiful, you've launched too late. What did that version one look like? And how much did it actually help you in terms of running the business?
Yeah. Yeah. I love the quote. If you're not embarrassed by your MVP, you've done
Mm.
too much. Um, but yeah, our tech stack was at the very beginning, it was Slack, Airtable, Zapier, and Card. Card, we had this like ridiculous 90s version landing page on purpose because we were like, we know that this is hacked together, so let's make it look like it is. And we just kind of leaned into that for a while. So I'll give you context on like our backgrounds because that might help.
Mm.
But Jake Singer, my co-founder, he he was a PM at Amazon. He studied finance. So he was like technically like all self-taught. And then our backgrounds, like our academic backgrounds are kind of opposite. I studied product design as an undergrad and then design engineering in grad school, but I was never like a proper engineer. But I love like the research component and going out and figuring out like what do we need to build? Who like what are we solving? Jake is very good at like self teaching himself like just coding, development, stuff like that. But when we were figuring out what problem we were solving, we both knew like we're not the most competent builders. So unless we know exactly what we need to build, let's not build anything. And so we took that philosophy in general forward to basically say like what is the most like the smallest MVP we could build to just prove out the fact that we're solving this problem in the right way. So that's like why we didn't build anything until we really needed to. And the first product that we built was, I guess I'll give the perspective of a publisher. So a newsletter writer would join the Slack community. They would go through the card landing page, get invited to the Slack community, join, and then they would hang out in there, talk to each other. We had some community like channels just talking about like growth monetization strategy in general. But we had this channel in Slack that was advertisers. And basically, when I went out, or when we went out and found a new advertiser that was just interested in newsletter advertising, they would have a different onboarding flow. And they would plug in a bunch of information, plug in like a point of contact. And then once we qualified that advertiser, we would shoot a ping over to that channel in Slack. And it would say, like, hey, there's a new advertiser that's interested in these types of newsletters to advertise with. If you want to get in contact and you fit this criteria, click this button. And that's where like Zapier came in. We would literally just like have somebody fill out a form and connect the advertiser to the newsletter writer over email. And that was it. That was like the first product. We were very aware that we were basically building a marketplace that sent people off of the marketplace because they would just talk to each other. We didn't have
Yeah.
anybody like transacting. We just introduced people. We asked people to keep us on the thread, but most of the time they would take us off. That was enough for us to realize like, okay, there's value in just creating these connections. It was very good for publishers because it enabled publishers to kind of sit back and wait for advertisers to come to them. We realized it wasn't great for advertisers because we were solving the problem advertisers had, the advertisers that wanted to sponsor newsletters, they had a discovery problem. So they didn't know like where to find the right newsletters, but they also had a bandwidth issue. So at the beginning, when we were sending these email introductions, we would send like 20 introductions to a random company that signed up. And that was great for them because they knew, hey, these 20 newsletters are newsletters that could work for us. But then they still had to like deal with the 20 newsletters and like broker a deal, negotiate, transact, all of that stuff. So that first iteration of the product, it told us, yes, we're solving the problem for publishers, we're solving half the problem for advertisers, but there's other things we need to do. And basically, as we did that, we would learn those like little bits of information, and that's what informed what is the next product we were going to build. I'll give like one more example of like the next step we took, but the two problems we recognized that we kind of built or like uncovered in that model was the one I just mentioned, where like we weren't helping advertisers solve the bandwidth problem. And then the other problem was publishers didn't know how to accept money and they didn't know what to do about that. And advertisers all also had their own kind of process and they all wanted to use like ACH or whatever
Yeah.
whatever they use. So the first actual tool that we built was an invoicing tool for publishers and it was free. So we basically said like, we're going to introduce you to an advertiser. And then once you need to like invoice them, log into this platform and you can invoice them. And we covered the Stripe fees. So by being free, if you went onto Stripe or if you like used a different platform, you would lose 2.8%, whatever it is, plus 30 cents. But if you use the Swapstack invoicing tool, we would lose a little bit of money, but they would get paid exactly what they charged. So we solved like that part of the product for them. Basically, we tried to like bookend the marketplace transaction and start building products that supported each and every little interaction in between.
I love how resourceful you guys were in every step of it. Another theme is that some of the products that you created were free, right? Also this invoicing tool, or even like negative, right? Because you're bearing the cost of Stripe. How important do you think it is to actually launch with a free product? Because when you talk about it, it sounds like all we wanted to do was prove that money was flowing through the platform because we know that eventually we'll be able to capture some of that value. Whereas the other school of thought is just try and get money as quick as possible to prove it. Like, what's your thoughts on launching with a free product versus actually paying from the start?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the what the product is and what the problem that you're solving is. Um, we so the product was free. That invoicing tool was free for publishers. It wasn't free for advertisers. We would tack on a 10% fee. So we were like revenue positive from the beginning when we started like realizing or like transacting value or facilitating value exchange. I think I lean towards like if you have a product that should be charged for and you've proven that you're solving a problem, you should charge right away if you can. But from pretty much the entire time, the way we built products were let's make them free or extremely cheap for the creator because the problem we're solving for them is monetization. And then we'll make money on the advertiser side. So most of the products that we built were free for publishers. We always monetize either on the advertiser side or somewhere like in the marketplace transaction that was kind of baked into the experience.
Okay, awesome. And you said that at every point you learned from customer feedback and you iterated the product. And
Yeah.
hacking together those no-code tools such as Airtable and Zapier is quick. And then you have another level, which is going to Bubble, which is quicker than traditional code, but it still takes time, effort, energy, money, general resources. What was the point that you realized, okay, cool. Now we need to move away from this hacky platform to really build on something more comprehensive and with Bubble?
Yeah. I think that that invoicing tool that we built was the first product we built on Bubble. And there was a couple things in there. One was like, yes, we want to solve this problem that publishers don't know how to accept money. And we also wanted to like capture the value that we were creating. The other problem was that it was really hard to build the concept of a user profile with that like hacked together tech stack that we were using. And we knew we wanted to like build a product that had something that like you log into and it enables us to just have like a more real user experience. So the combination of all those things, like recognizing, okay, we want to build an actual product that can accept money. And then we really are at a point where we have, I think that point we had like a couple hundred people in the Slack community. And we were calling them users, but they weren't really users because they were just like part of a community and they weren't really using a product because we were kind of just like sending them emails. Once we got to a point where we realized, hey, we want to know if these are users. We want to like do more proper like SaaS stuff, for lack of a better term. That's when we realized, hey, let's build a product that can actually support like a profile creation. The reason we chose Bubble is mainly because Jake had some prior experience with Bubble and he wasn't like a self-taught like full stack developer and he was just comfortable with it. I think they had also just raised their $100 million like Series A. So we were like, okay, Bubble's not going to die in anytime soon. Yeah. And so we just said like we can get to market really quick on this. Let's build it.
Now, so Bubble had raised 100 mil, and you guys are now seen as one of the real Bubble success stories. We've got you featured as one of the most beautiful Bubble apps created.
Yeah.
Um, how much did Bubble help you create the product, iterate, and actually just grow the business?
I mean, it helped immensely. It allowed us, like, Jake was immediately comfortable building an actual product. And so it really meant that we could go from that place where, hey, the MVP is proving out that we're solving a problem in a way that we can like build into a business to let's build like the next version of the MVP or the V1 right away. We didn't have to go out and hire anybody. We didn't really have to do that much aside from design it and then build it. It just enabled us to get to market really fast. And I think that's the general power of no code, where and like the way AI is going to like impact no code in a good way. It just enables so many people to just like go and build it.
Whatever idea they have now, they can go and build it.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think there's a better answer than that. It was just like the fastest way we could see to get to market.
No code is amazing, and Bubble is such a powerful tool, but of course it has its flaws. What were some of the issues that you faced in building with Bubble? Because you were still relatively early in building with Bubble and no code.
Yeah. I think Jake will probably be a lot better at speaking to this, but from my perspective, there was a couple things, both like at the beginning and some of them are like more longer term, but I think being at the early stages of like Bubble becoming like more of like a robust platform, there was still like there was some like bugs in the Bubble platform that we had to figure out how do we like interact with an API in a way
Mm.
where we want to. There weren't that many companies that were doing like payments. So like interacting with Stripe's connected accounts or marketplace API, we just kind of had to like figure that out. Whereas like if you were developing on regular code, it's just like a super easy, you just call the API and it's pretty simple. I think at the beginning, now not so much at all. It was harder to develop something that was like beautiful. And us as like not the best like designers, it was hard to like build a product in Bubble that was really nice looking. That didn't really matter to us. It wasn't a problem, but that was definitely a limitation. I think the bigger limitations or like perceived limitations were later on where we were bringing on a couple of other Bubble developers. We ended up working with Kelly Klaus, who's a legend in the Bubble community. I don't know why she worked with us, but if you're listening, Kelly, I love you. She's incredible. But once we got to a point where we had like more than two people building on Bubble, it was definitely much harder to just like manage bigger projects. I think you mentioned last time we talked that they shipped a solution to that. But at the time, we just at some point we had five people building. And I remember getting feedback from Jake that it was just really hard to manage like who's shipping, who's like building, how do you like not screw everybody up? That was hard. And then a little bit longer term too, if you have a company that's running on no code and you want to build it into like a 20-person engineering org, that collaboration will be an issue. But also at the time, like the full stack engineering community is just probably like 100x bigger than the no code community. And of course, there's like incredible talent in the no code community and the Bubble community, but it's just smaller. So like finding the right person to come on board and help you build is just going to be that much harder.
I
And
guess finding high quality developers because it was an early space. And I guess now it's improved, but still you have to do some like real proper vetting.
yeah, exactly. And none of that is saying like it's not doable. That is just like a natural limitation because it's a smaller
Yeah.
ecosystem.
One of my like the reason I love your story so much is because a lot of the concerns that people have about no code, you've kind of like debunked, right? Can you have a beautiful bubble app? Actually, you said it wasn't that beautiful at the start, but it became a beautiful bubble
Yeah.
app. Can it be successful? It was acquired. But before that, people still doubt, okay, can you actually raise investment from a no-code built product? And you guys did, you raised like over $600,000 from angels. Just talk us through that process. What was it like to raise money with a no-code built product? Did people even care that Swapstack was built with no code?
Yeah, it's funny. People didn't care. I think they would have cared if we talked about all like the things that could go wrong, but those are also things that could go wrong if you build on like a
Mhm.
more like traditional tech stack. But yeah, so we only raised a pre-seed. Basically, when we were talking to investors, we told them what we were building on if they asked. Most didn't ask. And if we got questions around like, hey, is Bubble scalable or what are you going to do in the future? Are you going to like build off? One of the things about fundraising is that like A, it's a full-time job. B, you're selling a vision. And part of your job when you're fundraising is like selling the vision of what you see the company being able to be. And you also have to like kind of recognize, okay, what thought patterns and what ideas are investors latching onto and like lean into those. And so the fundraising process was much more about like selling the vision and like helping investors see based on like their understanding of the market and like their understanding of like the newsletter space in this case and the marketing space where the problem that we're solving can turn into a big company or a big business, less so about like what is the tech stack that you're using. So by nature of just like how we were raising, the tech stack didn't really come up or it didn't really matter. When it did, we would basically just say like what we kind of talked about today, like we're not engineers, so we just like got to market as fast as possible. And it actually helped quite a bit because it showed investors that like, hey, these are two like non-technical engineers, and they just said like, okay, we're gonna solve this problem because we want to, and they figured it out. They figured out how to like get to a place where they're doing a couple hundred K in GMV a month without having an engineer. That is a much potentially a much like stronger story than somebody coming in and saying like, I spent a year trying to find a technical co-founder so I could build this thing, and now we're doing like we just did our first transaction last week.
Yeah,
Uh,
no.
so it really does help. I think we definitely at the beginning we were like, yeah, when we get to a place where we have product market fit and we feel like we're growing beyond the bubble, the confines of bubble, we'll build the product in a more traditional tech stack. That was always part of the narrative for sure. That was enough for investors to be like, okay, cool.
Do you think that was an important part of the narrative because you dealt with their potential concern?
The concern was not a like the concerns were not big. The most important of those of that kind of ramble, the most important part of the narrative was actually leaning into the fact that we were able to build something without being technical. Because it showed like this is where like the ego part of fundraising comes in. It just
Mhm.
showed that like, okay, we cared a lot about this problem and we were going to figure it out no matter what. And at the very early stages, that's what a lot of investors are looking for. They're looking for like, okay, are these people going to figure it out? Are they just like, do they have that drive to do it? And do they understand the problem? That's where we leaned into quite a bit. There was really not much concern about, hey, Bubble is a no code platform. It was more like, is this problem going to be solved? and is it going to be a big business or not?
And you showed how resourceful you were, and you showed the traffic because the numbers that you were doing were big enough to show that it was a serious business, right? What were some of the traction points that you were hitting when you raised that pre-seed?
I'll actually take a tangent really quick because we we were building for about 3 months, and then On Deck itself actually acquired us. And so I forget if we talked about this last time, but On Deck acquired us because On Deck was expanding. Their first product was On Deck Founders, so it was like a small community of founders, and then they expanded to like On Deck course creators, On Deck
Yeah.
writers. They had all these different communities, and they ended up, at the time it was like an acqui-hire because we were very early on, and they were like, let's build Swapstack to connect all of our communities together. We ended up within On Deck for about 6 months, realized, hey, it actually doesn't really make sense for us to be within On Deck. So we ended up spinning out. And when we spun out, we basically bought the company back from them, and they had launched an accelerator called so we entered ODX and took an investment from them, and we used that as a springboard to raise our series or our pre-seed. And so when we were raising our pre-seed, we went to market with, hey, we're already like part of ODX. We were like the first company in ODX. We use that as a badge of like validity. And then what we did, we opened up an RUV. So it was an AngelList RUV. It's called a roll-up vehicle, which basically allows you to collect really small checks. So you can collect checks from anyone who's an accredited investor down to $1,000. We opened up an RUV and basically went into our community of users and said, hey, we're going to raise around and we're going to try to build this into like $1 billion business. If anybody wants to get involved, you can invest. And we ended up raising about like maybe 20, 30K from existing users before we went out into the market and actually raised from investors. And at that time, we were talking to investors and kind of seeding like, hey, we're going to raise, we're doing this thing. We just spun out all this stuff. But so to answer your question, the metrics that we brought to investors were, if I remember correctly, we had done maybe like 100K in GMV or 100K in revenue, a couple 100K in GMV, something along those lines. Some numbers that were above in the six figures, they were like real. So we brought them that. We brought them also, hey, we have 10, 15 existing Swapstack users that invested in the product. And we also are part of this accelerator. So all of those points that showed like, hey, we are transacting value, our users are basically like giving us back the money that they earned on the platform because they believe in the company. Oh, and we're like in this accelerator and like our previous acquirers are investing in us. And so those like 3 points enabled us to get a lot of meetings, and they were probably pretty pivotal in getting the first couple checks in.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's just undeniable traction. I did not realize that there were two acquisitions.
Yeah, we sold twice, I guess.
That's cool. And just lastly, we fast forward, Beehiiv acquires Swapstack. What was that process like? How did it come about?
So basically, after the pre-seed, we didn't raise again. At that time, we had like going into On Deck and coming out was like, it was exciting, but it was also really draining. And we're like, we don't want to do this process again. And we don't want to have like overlords telling us what to do. So we decided, hey, we're going to raise a pre-seed. We're not going to give away that much of the company, no board seats, and we're just going to do our thing and try to build this into like a pretty solid business. That's why we did end up raising another round. And then we built for about a year and a half. We tried a bunch of different types of or like avenues within the newsletter monetization space. And we were like slowly growing. We were acquiring users on both sides pretty well. And then about a year and a half ago, the acquisition to Beehiiv happened about 6 months ago. So a year and a half ago now, we started recognizing that in the newsletter space, there's like Substack, Beehiiv, ConvertKit, a couple of others that were the platforms. And then there was a bunch of other smaller companies that were either like in our direct space around monetization or in spaces that were helping companies or newsletter writers grow. There's a lot more competition popping up. And then there's a couple like small acquisitions happening and a couple like mergers happening. There's a company called SparkLoop that was bought by ConvertKit. They were like basically what Swapstack originally was, like newsletter to newsletter advertising. And so basically a year and a half ago, me and Jake had like a 3-day powwow in New York. We like did a bunch of whiteboarding. We got drunk one night and just like talked about what we wanted to do with the company. And we were recognizing that, hey, there's a lot of action happening in the marketplace or in the market. Either if we don't like grow really fast, we felt like, hey, we're gonna like kind of teeter on the edge. So either we have to have like go out and raise more money and like really lean in and grow really fast, or find what we called an intimate partnership with a platform that we could help like take the vision of Swapstack to the next level. And that's when we kind of decided, hey, let's like put out our feelers to see like would anybody be interested in doing some sort of acquisition. And so that's kind of when we started looking around. And then we had a bunch of conversations with a couple of platforms. Beehiiv is just such like a machine, shipping so many products. I think the way they build is very in tune. This is like how I felt before too. So I'm not just tooting their own Beehiiv horn, even though I'm definitely drinking the Kool-Aid. Very in tune with just like how newsletters like to build. And what we really loved was that like the comparison of a Beehiiv to a Substack. Substack came into the market and said like, hey, we want journalism, or we have a vision for how journalism should happen on the internet. So we're going to build a product for that. And then Beehiiv came into the market, and with what Tyler Dank saw at Morning Brew, and basically said like, hey, we know that newsletters can be a business, and we know that a newsletter needs like 10, 20 tools for that business to run. So we're just going to build a product that enables these newsletters to use all the tools they need to build a business. So those like two philosophies are completely different. And the Beehiiv's philosophy aligns to very much how we were thinking about helping newsletter writers create businesses with monetization through Swapstack. So we kind of just leaned into that conversation and tried to make it happen.
What's the future of Swapstack and Beehiiv now?
Yeah. So if you go to swapstack.co or .com, you'll be sent to the Beehiiv ad
Yeah.
network. Um, my baby is integrated, but but essentially what we're doing at Beehiiv. So we have about 15,000 newsletters that run on Beehiiv, and we're building an ad network that sits on top of that. And so that's basically where the vision of Swapstack is. We're building a whole suite of advertising tools, starting with an ad network that essentially, if you publish your newsletter on Beehiiv, you'll get opportunities to monetize through the ad network. So you'll get a notification saying like, hey, Betterment wants to sponsor your newsletter. You're going to get paid $2 per click. And then you have like 2 clicks, you get the ad injected into your newsletter, and you just monetize really easily. The vision, there's multiple visions, but I want to ensure that pretty much any publisher on Beehiiv, if they want to monetize, they're able to. I want to be able to like fill every single piece of advertising inventory in any newsletter that's on Beehiiv with a Beehiiv ad network facilitated ad. Um, and basically fulfill the general larger vision of, hey, if you want to build a business and you want to have like a real revenue stream, you can do it on Beehiiv, and we're going to help you do it. And it'll
Awesome.
be
The future's bright. Thanks, Jake.